As we learnt in the last presentation, ancient Egypt was a long country that was settled mainly around the Nile River. The rest of the country, as you can see in the map on this page, was desert. These environmental factors were an essential feature of why civilization developed in what we now call ancient Egypt, but not in other parts of the world at the same time. In this presentation, we will look at how the closeness of ancient Egypt to the Nile River and the desert affected the culture of that civilization. The Nile River begins in Central Africa and flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. Ancient Egypt's desert environment made the Nile a very important environmental feature. It was so essential for the society's survival that the people worshipped it as a god. They called the god Hapi, whose image you can see on this page next to the map. The Nile had three main sources: the White Nile, the Blue Nile, and the Atbara River. The Blue Nile and the Atbara River begin in the highlands of Central Africa. Every summer they are flooded by melting snow and heavy rains. These waters gush into the Nile, carrying a load of dark mountain silt, soil that is rich in nutrients. Every year this increase of water caused the Nile to burst its bank and flood parts of Egypt. Today dams have been built along the Nile to prevent it from flooding, but in the days of ancient Egypt these dams did not exist. Every year in June the Nile would flood its banks and leave a pile of dark, fertile soil all over the land nearby. This flooding season was known as inundation. As soon as the floodwaters went back down, the farmers would plant crops. These crops would grow very quickly in this fertile soil. So this flooding was important to providing food for ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians called the fertile land around the river with rich dark soil the Black Land, and this is where most people lived. In the desert area around the Nile, where very few people lived, the ancient Egyptians named those areas the Red Land. Living in the desert affected the way the ancient Egyptians dressed. They tended to dress very lightly. The men, including the pharaoh, often wore bare-chested outfits and would often wear short linen tunics. Women usually wore linen dresses. Linen is a natural fabric made from a flax plant that allows perspiration to evaporate more easily. Most clothing was white, which is cooler than darker colours because it reflects the heat. Leather or papyrus sandals were sometimes worn by the rich, but most people went barefoot. Children and slaves were usually completely naked. This image here is of a typical family. The males are not wearing any tops, and the women are wearing very thin white gowns. In this image here, this farming family shows how most poorer members of the society would work in bare feet. You can imagine how difficult that would have been for them. This image is an image of a pharaoh, and he is likewise not wearing any top, although he is wearing some military outfit that covers a part of the upper part of his body. But he is wearing what we know as a tunic, which is similar to a skirt around the lower part of his body. This image here shows some wealthy Egyptian women in the home, again wearing very nice but very thin white gowns to deal with the heat. In this presentation, we have learned how the flooding of the Nile River was essential to the survival of ancient Egypt, as it provided the people with food. Due to the heat of the deserts, ancient Egyptians also wore very light clothing to deal with the climate.